all of you for having us here today. This is obviously a great and very interesting topic for us to talk about, very timely. As you know, when we think about crisis, I think about the first part of my career that Steve mentioned, working in Congress. Now, in Congress, everything is about crisis. You're either reacting to one or you're trying to create one to pass a legislative agenda. As a former congressman from Illinois and now mayor of the city of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel used to say, never let a good crisis go to waste. Different perspective here, of course, as we talk about corporate governance and protecting enterprise value at corporations during crises. And I think, very timely now, of course, is that as we open a newspaper, I think this morning, for example, I looked cursory looked early this morning at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. I've stopped counting at about 20 stories where you saw evidence or examples of crises, past, current, present, developing, and what have you. And while, just like snowflakes and oil wells, no two crises are exactly alike, they certainly share the same characteristics. There are certainly signs of things that might have been pointed out. And I think a lot of times, in most cases, when the final analyses are done, we determined that most are entirely preventable. Preventable had there been stronger corporate governance, more rigorous analysis, more rigorous oversight, and enterprise risk management, which is exactly why we're here today, of course, is to talk about that. And we have two very distinguished guests here, experts in the subject, as Steve introduced. So with that, I think we get right to it. And James, I'll ask you to start with your presentation in your capacity at E-Trade and tell that story.
Great. Thanks. I'll just stand up and let me first answer Steve's question. My son Garrett had two major accomplishments last year. We're very proud of him. One was to break Guinness Book of World Records for standing on an exercise ball for 5 hours and 25 minutes. And he did that for charity. And then after that, he was named a 2016 Rhodes Scholar. So that was a very proud year for us. What I want to do in the next few minutes is to set the stage in terms of our panel discussion by sharing with you the E-Trade story. And the E-Trade story, I think, will be very familiar to you in terms of some of the challenges. We are known as a digital disruptor. So back in the early 80s, we executed the first electronic trade for a retail investor. And for a long time, the company did very well. It grew, it innovated, and at one point, the market cap was over $100 billion. And the internet bubble happened, and so it was looking for other sources of growth. And it really picked the wrong strategy at the wrong time and acquired a lot of mortgage-backed securities, asset-backed securities, right before the financial crisis. So we were at the brink of bankruptcy and had to deal with a lot of regulatory scrutiny. We're under 2 MOUs from the Federal Reserve and the OCC. We had activist investor on our board, and we were very thin in terms of capitalization. I joined the board of E-Trade in November of 2012, and it was a really exciting time for me because it's always been a professional ambition of mine to join a public company board. And they asked me to chair the Risk Oversight Committee. And at that time, we pursued a turnaround plan. And the turnaround plan had two things. One, is very traditional. We had to clean up the balance sheet, deleverage the balance sheet. We sold loans, raised capital and cash, reduce expenses, really to stabilize the business. The second thing we did was to establish an enterprise risk, compliance, and audit infrastructure so that we won't get into a situation like that in the future. So let me share with you some of the fundamentals that we focused on. So first thing is, the time of the risk committee is valuable. We meet a few times a year, and I wanted to make sure that we had a strong agenda. So we want to have a calendar, a structure, so that we're covering all the major risk issues at the committee. And we also want to expand the scope of our work beyond financial risk. So it's not just about credit risk, market risk, and liquidity risk. We also want to look at strategic risk, which is what got us into trouble, and also operational risk. The second thing was to strengthen the independence of our risk and compliance function. Right? So it's very important to have an independent board of directors, and it's important to have an independent audit function, which has a dotted line or solid line to the audit committee, right? Mostly a solid line. But what about the risk and compliance functions? How do we enhance the independence of that? So at most companies, there's an org chart. There might be a dotted line reporting from the chief risk officer, chief compliance officer to the risk oversight committee. But my question when I joined the board of E-Trade was, what does that dotted line mean? Right? What does it say? And then we wanted to formalize and document that in our charter. And what we said was the CEO or the senior management cannot hire, fire, or change the compensation of the chief risk officer, the chief compliance officer, without my committee's prior approval. And what that does, in a very simple way, is to enhance independence. These functions could speak up when they see issues without fear of their job security or compensation. So another basic thing that we put in place. Third, we wanted to have a set of risk policies for different types of risk, from strategic risk, reputational risk, operational risk, in addition to the financial risk policy that we had in place. But one of the most important policies is the risk appetite statement. So the risk appetite statement basically says, what type of risks, at what level, are we willing to accept in pursuit of our business strategy? And that creates a framework for the board and management to talk about risk issues, metrics, and risk tolerance levels. So that was a very important work that we did. And then we also want to make sure the information that goes to the board is effective and timely, highlighting key risk trends, decision points. So we redesigned the risk report. And right now I would say it's probably one of the best reports I see anywhere. I have a copy. If you want to take a look, I could show you that later. But I think it's very important for the board to have good information, that it supports our discussions and our decision points. And lastly, I think one of the most important things in any process is to have a good feedback loop. So how do we know if the risk management program is working effectively? So how do we know if the risk management program is working effectively? And that speaks to having a feedback loop that gives you continuous monitoring, continuous reporting on effectiveness. And what we did was to look at earnings at risk analysis in the beginning of a period and earnings attribution analysis at the end of the period. So one's forward-looking, the other's backward-looking. This way, we could isolate unexpected earnings volatility. So many of you are going through some challenging times now, right? So oil prices dropped from $100 a barrel to $30 a barrel. It's very natural for many of you to be surprised by how rapid that drop has been, but it shouldn't be surprised in terms of how that's impact your financial and business performance, because that's what risk management is about, to be able to understand how external factors could affect financial performance. So in terms of this feedback loop, what we wanted to do is to make sure we understand in the beginning of the period what's driving earnings in terms of volatility. So here, this examples of of that in terms of interest rates, business plan, credit performance. So that's the forward-looking earnings at risk analysis. And then at the end of the period, we'll do an earnings attribution analysis to see what really happened, what were the things that we identified in the beginning of the period, and what were the unforeseen factors. So to me, the objective of enterprise risk management is to minimize unexpected earnings volatility. So it's not to minimize earnings volatility, but sometimes you want to take more risk and be exposed to higher degrees of earnings volatility. Risk is not bad, right? But risk from factors that you are unaware of, that's bad. And so the objective is to minimize that, and we've developed that as a feedback loop. And in terms of results, this is a 3-year period. Our market cap, our profitability increased about 300%. Our capital position is stronger. Our debt rating went from single B to triple B. Moody's has also upgraded us to a triple B level. And it's the first time in the history of the company when we have an investment grade rating. Most importantly, we were under 2 MOUs from the Fed and the OCC. And as you might know, when you're under MOU, you need permission to go to the bathroom. Right? You are under a lot of constraint in terms of what you could do with your business and your capital. It's no fun, right? And those MOUs were lifted. Now we are having a very different type of discussion at the board. It's much more strategic. So what I wanted to do is to set the stage for our discussion and share with you some of the fundamentals of risk management that we focused on. So I like to think of it in terms of golf, right? So when you're playing golf, it doesn't matter if you're putting or you're hitting a wedge or iron shot or a driver. There's some fundamentals, right? You keep your head steady, right? You swing, not hit the ball, and you accelerate and never decelerate when you're hitting a shot. So there's some fundamentals when it comes to golf, and risk management is the same thing. And I just want to share with you the 5 fundamentals that we focused on at E-Trade.
Thank you, James. That was excellent. But even with fundamentals, I can't keep the ball on the other fairway. Michael, turn this over to you to talk about Volkswagen.
Thank you very much, Brian. And I just really have one slide. And I'll start by actually explaining. Some of you may recall this photograph. It's a screenshot from Volkswagen's 2014 Super Bowl commercial. And it portrays an engineer, one of the company's engineers, with angel wings. And you may recall that actually at the time quite successful marketing campaign that tried to portray the engineers as angels. And you really couldn't write this in any better way, what happened at Volkswagen. So just keep that in mind as I try to dissect what happened at this company that is Germany's largest corporation. It's a company with 600,000 employees. It's by Fortune revenue standards, it's the 9th largest corporation on the Global 500. And it's a company that is still very much in the middle of a slow-moving, potentially existential disaster. And you think about Volkswagen, but there are lots of other brands, of course, that are owned by the company and part of the Volkswagen Group. Audi, Porsche, some of you maybe Bentley, Ducati motorcycles. It's a very large corporation. And one of the things that I like to talk about, as Steve mentioned earlier, I grew up in Germany, and I lived in Germany for 20 years. And it's always difficult to stereotype an entire country. But I think that everyone here in the room who either has spent time in Germany or has encountered anyone of German descent would say that Germans are fairly rule-bound people. We tend to be punctual. In many ways, we love rules. And there's an old joke that I learned as a kid in high school when I was trying to learn French. And the joke was that in in French, there are a lot of exceptions to the grammar rules. In German, there are no exceptions because when there's an exception, they just make a new rule out of it. That's very German, and that's the truth. I think that it really is, in many ways, flabbergasting how with a country that loves rules, how this could have happened. And many Germans will not cross the street at night when the sign is red, even if there's no cars anywhere nearby, and that just comes naturally to us. I was asked by NACD in December, just a few months after this development sort of first hit the press in the U.S., to write an article that'll be in directorship in the March-April issue. I think it'll be shipped in the next week or so you will be able to sort of read the longer version of this. But again, I'm very excited to be here today and to be back in Houston and to share with you my analysis from a corporate governance perspective of what happened. So the first thing that happened that I'd like to point out is take a look at the supervisory board at Volkswagen. And just as a brief background, under German corporate governance rules, they're a little bit different. You have a system called co-determination that actually obligates the company to include workers in the supervising of management. This actually leads, has a lot of positives to it, frankly, but it also leads to very large boards. So the Volkswagen board at the time of the crisis last August, September, that is the most relevant time, and that's been the size of the board really for years, had 20 members, which is fairly large. Now, the crux of the matter that is sort of one of the key takeaways from today that I want to share with you is out of 20 members, 1 was independent by any type of a corporate governance standard. Also, from a geographic diversity perspective, here you have a company that sells its products all over the world, in the United States, in China, all over the world. Out of the 20 board members, 17 were either German or Austrian. 2 were Qatari, based on the Qatari fund, sovereign wealth fund investing in the company. And the one independent one, was from Scandinavia. And so you have, even if you didn't think about all that sort of went on, Volkswagen has not exactly been batting 1,000 in the United States for the last 10 years. It's been struggling in this very large consumer market. There was not one American on the supervisory board. So I think that, as I was looking at all of this and looking also at the committee structure at the supervisory board level, it became very clear that this is a board that would either be unwilling or unable to effectively challenge management with whatever management might want to do. So that is really point 1. Point 2 is also quite interesting, and I'd like to ask the audience how many of you have read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. It's a fairly popular book. You see a lot of hands are going up. And it was published a few years ago. And there's an anecdote in the book. It's not about the automobile industry, but I believe it's relevant. Malcolm Gladwell shares in the book what happened in Korea with the airlines, with Korean Airlines, which in the 90s had a string of catastrophic accidents that actually went so far as to lead the FAA to cancel their landing permits in the United States, which if you're an airline, that's not a good sign. So there was an exhaustive analysis done back in the 90s to try and pinpoint, is there something wrong in their maintenance department? Is there something wrong technically? And what turned out is it was the cockpit culture. So in the Korean culture, and as we discussed last night with James and others, very much in the Asian culture, it's also in the Japanese and to a large extent really across the region, there's a very hierarchical setup. There's a lot of deference to seniority, a lot of deference to people that are older than you. And so as they analyzed cockpit recordings and flight data recorders from many of these accidents, you had situations where sometimes the captain did something wrong. The co-pilot noticed it and didn't do anything because they didn't feel that it was for them to sort of challenge, upper management, if you will, being the captain. And so there was a lot of cultural work that had to be done at Korean Airlines before they actually were able to sort of get beyond this. Now, the reason I bring up this analogy from Malcolm Gladwell's book is that I believe there was very similar factors at work at Volkswagen. You have a culture that actively has discouraged dissent in the ranks. We set a goal. This goal must be met, and that's the end of it. And so I think that that corporate culture, that, by the way, for those of you who have been really closely monitoring the company over the last 20 years, there were several warning signs that leaked to the outside that could have really led people to take a closer look. One was in the early 90s, the largest corporate espionage scandal that ever took place in the automobile or manufacturing industry was the Lopez affair, where you had the head of GM purchasing, which really would be, in the automobile industry, it'd be the equivalent of the head of design at Apple. I mean, from just how critical they are to making the company successful, was hired away from GM to Volkswagen, showed up with 30 boxes of file folders of confidential materials from GM, and nobody at Volkswagen thought to say, well, go right back to where you came from. Instead, they actually utilized the information, and it led to a decade-long legal situation with criminal charges filed in multiple countries. And so this goes back 20 years ago. In 2006, 2007, there was a prostitution scandal at the company. I won't even go into that, but not good. As recently as 4 years ago, the then chairman of the board at Volkswagen, Ferdinand Piëch, who's a member of the Porsche family, thought it would be a good idea to put his wife, who was a kindergarten teacher, on the supervisory board. Now, if you're a shareholder sort of watching this, these would be things that, in retrospect, I think would be red flags. She actually served on the board for a while and has since resigned, of course. But from a cultural perspective, I think those are things, as you're looking at sort of what's going on, that were warning signs. Now, the third point that I want to mention that perhaps really was the what sort of made all of this then go off the rails was that about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, Volkswagen made a strategic, really bet the company decision on diesel. So when Toyota launched the Toyota Prius in Japan in 1997 and in 2000 in the US, a lot of car manufacturers started investing much more heavily in more energy-efficient technology. A lot of them went in the direction of hybrid electric, plug-in hybrid, and so forth. In the United States, 3% of passenger cars are diesels. A lot of people that learned about diesels in the U.S. Growing up, they remember that diesel smell. That diesel smell is nitrogen oxide. That's what gives it that diesel smell. Now, in Europe, approximately 50% of cars are diesel, engine-driven. Rudolf Diesel is a German who came up with the technology. It is more energy efficient, purely from a physics and chemistry perspective. So Volkswagen decided to put all its money on diesel. And what they hadn't counted on, again, no American on the board, what they had not counted on is that the emission standards that were promulgated by the EPA as well as by the California regulators, who were always really very forward-leaning, essentially, even though the company had basically 5 years warnings on some of these CAFE standards and things like that, basically in 2008, it was a situation where the company either would have to decide to not introduce their new line of cars or to come up with some other solution. And the other solution was to manipulate software so that nobody would be able to tell that their cars are emitting far, far in excess of what is allowed. And now, again, I would argue that when a company is in a situation where it's made a strategic bet that turns out to have been the wrong bet, that's when company culture and an effective supervisory board or board of directors really come into play. And obviously they did not. And so I think that's sort of the brief summary of the root causes of what happened at this great company that is in a lot of trouble. We could spend quite some time talking about all the ways in which they're in trouble, but I'll just add one last piece before I turn it back over to Brian. What have they done since this all became public in September? September 18th is when the news came out. 5 days later, Martin Winterkorn, who was the CEO of the company for several years, resigned. And they also decided to appoint a new chairman of the board for the supervisory board. And you might think that they would select someone with a lot of gravitas, somebody independent, somebody who has impeccable corporate governance credentials, somebody who has a record of successfully challenging entrenched management teams. Well, they did not. The gentleman that they selected as the new chairman of the Volkswagen board was the acting CFO of the company for the past 12 years. And so he doesn't meet really any of the criteria I just outlined, and he is now serving as the chairman of the board. Really, in many ways, within the company, from everything I've heard, there is a belief that they're sort of at the beginning of the end of the crisis. But a lot of other people really believe it's really just the end of the beginning.
Depending on who you ask, might be the beginning of the beginning. This is going to be out there for a long time. I think the culture piece is fascinating. We've got culture inside corporations, U.S. corporations, multinational corporations, but culture being key. I'm really interested here, when you think about some of the GM crisis or some of the other things that we've had here. This is a massive situation. There had to have been more than one or two people inside of Volkswagen that knew about this and knew about this for a long time. So I'm curious as to what insight you have as to how did this come out and how many people really inside of the Volkswagen organization knew about this and for how long and why it took so long to come to light now.
It's a great question. Actually, the way it came out is rather interesting because you had a non-profit organization in Europe that had been watching, that's an environmental nonprofit, that had been watching the emissions standards sort of on the spec sheet of the cars that Volkswagen and many other makers are selling around the world. And they noticed that the Golfs and Jettas and some of the Audis that Volkswagen was selling in the United States, on paper looked like they were putting out a lot less emissions than the ones selling in Europe. So they actually approached the company and said, what is stopping you from selling these lower emissions cars in Europe? We care greatly about the environment, and the company basically wasn't getting back to them. This is about 4 years ago. Company really wasn't getting back to them, and so ultimately they decided, in partnership with a West Virginia nonprofit, to actually come to the U.S. And they literally hooked up several cars with PVC tubing, going into the trunk and trying to capture what was going on, so they could learn, what VW was doing differently in the U.S. And of course, they came to the conclusion that those were just things on paper, and the reality was much worse. Now, the company was first informed of that, really about 3 years ago. Now. And so depending on what standards of regulation FD you might apply, they've been in violation of all sorts of securities rules in various countries. In the US, at least, there are about 20 days from, I think, early September to September 18th that the company did not inform shareholders on what they already knew and what they had already told regulators. But to your other question about how many people knew, you have a company of 600,000 employees. To say that there are only a few that knew about this is really an amazing thing to try. It has a lot of chutzpah, I think is the word to say that, because there were thousands of people that knew. This is a new engine that was developed in 2006, 2007, a diesel engine specifically for the U.S. market, literally everybody in the company knew that they were having issues with meeting the U.S. emission standards. Actually, for 3 years, between 2005 and 2008, they didn't sell diesel engines in the U.S. Because they couldn't meet the standards, and they developed a new engine. And when the new engine was finished and it still didn't meet the standards, it's not like all of a sudden, oh wow, what did we do to make it meet it? Certainly there were some people that didn't pay attention, but to say that the way that Volkswagen is managed is very centrally managed, and you have a command and control system. And so there's not only no question that the management board, sort of the senior executive team, all knew. There's no question that there were thousands of people in the company that knew.
Yeah, we didn't know is, in my business, referred to as off message for a crisis response in something like this, and just not plausible, obviously. So I think it very interesting that there should have been, of course, as you pointed out, red flags for shareholders who were paying close attention. And then, in a sense, a red flag internally that, hey, the jig is up. People are starting to dive into this, so they had a chance to get ahead of it, manage it, mitigate it, and deal with it for shareholders, and didn't. I think that's really interesting.
And by the way, I should just say the supervisory board, and in all likelihood there were only 4 or 5 people on that 20-person board that did know, because they were pretty much out of the loop and not really plugged in to sort of what was going on. And interestingly, it just again tells you all that went wrong. Most of the supervisory board members only found out about all of this from the newspapers.
Also an indication of a corporate governance problem.
Exactly.
James, I'm wondering, were there, in the E-Trade circumstance, in your experience there, looking back, were there similar red flags that investors should have flagged, that management could have flagged for the board internally? And what did you find most challenging there?
Yeah, I think at the highest level, a red flag would be moving away from your core business model and your core competence. I think the history of business has shown that so many times. And what's interesting is I'll give you some statistics. There's a number of research that has shown that when companies get into big trouble, as defined by a major drop in stock price, 60% of the time is due to strategic risk. 30% of the time is due to operational risk. And 10% of the time is due to financial risk. In terms of challenges, I think for the board to work effectively with management, I think the CEO has to be really bought in to risk and compliance. I think that's a big requirement. The chairman of the board has to be very supportive, and I had those 2 key ingredients when I joined the board, so it's been a very good experience.
That's great, and given the financial crisis that you had to manage here and learn from and put in emergency management, new risk policies, anything that you dealt with in that particular experience that is highly applicable, or key lessons learned that you might impart on people in the energy industry who, as we know, are facing some very difficult times financially as well?
Yeah, I think we talked about some of the fundamentals,
right.
Enhancing independence, having good reports, focusing on the right levels of risk, and having a feedback loop. But there's some intangibles as well. I think risk culture is huge, whether it's Volkswagen or Korean Air, and we do an annual risk culture survey to make sure that people feel comfortable in challenging management, the supervisors, and also to have a risk escalation policy. So when things are happening, you want to define when does it go up to the board, when does it go up to senior management, and when does it go to business unit management, so that you want to ensure that bad news or emerging risk are escalated and you could address it in a timely basis.
And to your point about assessing issues and what have you, and a lot of energy and industrial companies are, of course, very good and very learned in terms of operational risk and planning for what happens if the unthinkable happens. There's an operational incident, some kind of a disaster of a physical sort. How do we respond? I'm wondering about, in both of your perspectives, reputational risk. Is that assessed at the board level? Should it be? And secondly, when there is such an event, are companies, in your experience, properly putting in place plans, not just on the operational response side, but on the reputational response side? How do we mitigate this and manage it from a communications, from a broad stakeholder standpoint, such that we're hopefully dealing with a very short, compressed timeline where we have stakeholders being super watchful and what have you? What are your perspectives on that? I'll start with you, Jane.
Sure. First of all, I would say energy firms have an even greater challenge than financial institutions. So in the past few years, more than half my business have been working with energy firms. And when you look at their exposure and you look at energy price volatility, you're looking at 50, 60% standard deviations when financial firms, in terms of interest rates and credit spreads, might be 10, 15 standard deviations. So the price volatility is much higher. The operational risk and the potential impact on the environment and other key stakeholders are much greater, because you're not just dealing with money, you're dealing with a lot of important issues beyond that. In terms of reputational risk, we do have a reputational risk policy that defines who are our stakeholders: customers, regulators, business partners, social media, general public, and social environmental groups. And for each group, we define what are the right metrics to make sure that their perception of the company is positive, and if things are going south, that there is a process of identifying that and communicating that within and also outside the company. So that we want to make sure that's explicit, that we're not, just responding to an issue.
Warren Buffett said famously one time that it takes you decades to build a reputation, and it can just be minutes to have it all come down. And I think, one of the things that I didn't speak about earlier is the impact that this Volkswagen scandal has had on the German economy and on the reputation of the German engineering culture. I spend a lot of time in Asia, and I just got back from there last week, and I'm asked in all kinds of places just because of my background. People are basically telling me that they're questioning statements made by other automakers. By companies like Siemens, and things that they always sort of took for granted, that Germany is very much an engineering miracle in many ways of a country. And I think that what I've seen, Brian, is that a lot of boards tend to focus on the things that they know well based on who's on the boards. You have operational people on the board, you have financial people. They start practicing for and preparing for a plant explosion or for something happening on the financial side. I think that it's unfortunately not very common yet to plan for something that is purely really reputational in nature, and to really have a plan A, B, C, D in place. And you can't at that point, especially in this day in the age of social media, where a crisis can spread within seconds and minutes around the world. There may have been a report in some local German newspaper that we would never hear about, even perhaps 6 or 7 years ago, that now spreads very, very quickly. And I think boards need to be better prepared, and in most cases really need to rely on outside advisors to have a plan in place to be able to jump into action when the unforeseen happens, because by design, a crisis is unexpected. It's not something that you see coming, but you can certainly prepare for it.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good answers here. I think one interesting experience I would impart in that regard is that the Transocean matter. So on April 21st, 2010, when that rig exploded and subsequently sank, my firm was called in to help Transocean deal with it. You're talking about, at that time, a company, $20 billion market cap, largest offshore driller in the world, 150 rigs around the globe, 20,000 employees. Guess how many in-house communications folks? 1. In-house legal counsel, 8. So they really had to very quickly manage and refer to outside people, engage outside people for help in that regard. Obviously, and this leads into a question from the audience here, an extraordinarily taxing and stressful situation for management. While they had great operational response plans as engineers, this was, of course, a tragedy for the company, a tragedy for the industry. How are we going to deal with this and keep running the business at the same time? So the first question from the audience, I think, is a very interesting one, and there's probably a lot of lessons learned here in your experiences as well in crises. Given recent headlines and news releases, have your boards or clients addressed the mental health of your senior executives during times like these, as they handle stress and cope with failures, with these big types of catastrophic events? Tough leaders don't like to talk about feelings, but it is vitally important that they do in any hope for a sustainable recovery. So, any comments on that? Michael?
It's a great question. I have not seen I've not seen that yet. I think it's but it's a great point.
I think for us it's having a very open board environment where senior executives, including the CEO, could be very candid about what's going on. I think if there's some operational market issues that have come up that might be unexpected, we just want to kind of talk about it and what are the implications. If there are some control issues and risk, compliance, or audit, and we want to deal with it in a very objective way. I think to the extent that you have objective criteria, assessment, metrics, risk tolerances, it really takes the emotion out of it. If everything is subjective, based on opinions, based on feelings, then it gets, I think, more of a mental health challenge, right? So I think one of the things that risk management is trying to do is to make it evidence-based, make it objective. Similarly with a feedback loop, it's trying to apply the scientific method to the process, but there's always the culture issues, intangible issues, and you deal with both, right?
I'd like to add one point to
Please.
this, Brian, if you don't mind. And I have had lots of conversations with people about this. We're in a world where senior executives of Fortune 100 or Fortune 500 companies are, I mean, a friend of mine once said we're all in sort of some kind of a collective state of zombie coma in terms of constantly traveling, dealing with hundreds and hundreds of incomings on a daily basis. And it's sometimes very difficult to separate the noise from the signal. And I think that's, again, where a board can play a very critical role. Because you have senior executive teams that are working very, very hard, and again, especially in global corporations. And I think that you would not want a surgeon operating on one of your children, who has been up for 20 hours straight, 17 of those in an operating room. You'd want somebody who has, slept in, and who's well rested coming off their vacation. And when you're looking at some of the decision-making going on in executive suites around the world, they're made by people that are working on 3, 4, 5 hours sleep max, sometimes for weeks and weeks in a row. And I think that perhaps that does tie into sort of the mental state that has led to some of this decision-making.
It's a great point. Great point. We all know, of course, that the management team has a duty to keep the board informed, and the board, of course, has a fiduciary duty to make sure they are informed. But this is, I think, a key area, especially in crisis and enterprise risk management. This question from the audience is, culture is a function of leadership and the people who run the company. How does the board ensure that it really knows senior management and what culture they have created and what is going on behind the scenes? James?
Well, I mentioned the risk culture survey, which all of our colleagues participate in. So we have a lot of good information from the employee base in terms of where the gaps are, what things we need to work on. In addition to the culture survey, we have training, we have workshops, town halls, and the CEO and the executive team are engaged in that. So it's just not the risk management professionals that are out there talking about risk. It's the business leaders out there talking about risk management and why it is important. And the other key driver of culture is incentives, right? People don't do what you tell them to do, they do what you pay them to do. And unless you incorporate risk and audit and compliance performance into compensation, then you would be fighting an uphill battle. And so I think there are different levers in terms of shaping culture and shaping employee behavior, and you need to apply all of them.
I think it's a very, very good point, James. And I think, a saying is also that people don't do what you expect, they do what you inspect. And I think that it's really, a lot of this is about authentic, inclusive leadership styles as well. I think that if you have a situation where the CEO is actively trying to keep board members away from his or her senior executive team, that's obviously red flags waving in your face. I think that there has to be access for directors by traveling to different different company locations, and without that being heavily stage managed by somebody. I think that those are ways that directors and shareholders, and to an extent, can get a sense of what is the culture in the company. But you have to incentivize it from a compensation perspective as well.
Yeah. And I think the CEO is so critical. One of my favorite stories at Ford Motors. So when McNally joined Ford Motors, they used to have a weekly operational committee where they have all the financial and operational dashboards around the room, and it's always green, right? Week after week green. And then one time there was a red signal, and he asked the operational manager what was it about, and he goes, "Oh, this is what's happening. I need some help." And he and the rest of the executive committee gave him a standing ovation, right? And then from that week on, they had red and yellow signals all over the place. And this changes the culture of that organization by how the leader reacted to information. And so to the extent that you have good information, good dashboards, and you deal with yellows and you deal with reds in a very objective way, I think that's much more constructive, right?
And that person who was the first who had the courage to put the red signal up is now the CEO of the company.
Yeah,
Mark Fields.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
How about ethics? We have a question on ethics, which of course is key, and it's for you, Michael. The Volkswagen, great engineering company, of course, but Volkswagen had an ethics problem. You identified some of those issues previously. How should any board, including Volkswagen, deal with ethics?
Well, I think it comes down to the most important responsibility that a board has, and that is to select the executive leadership team and the CEO. And that was, of course, made very difficult in the Volkswagen case by the fact that you had only one member on a 20-member board who really could be deemed independent of the controlling shareholders and the owners of the company. And so I think that it goes to a lot of the things that we've been talking about. It's making sure that you constantly test the true fundamentals of the ethics of the person and the people that you've selected to run the company, and that there are different rules in different countries about how long a director can be deemed independent based on their tenure on the board. There are people that come onto boards that are perhaps independent, but after 10 years, are you really still independent? And also, what is the proportion of compensation that you're receiving from that directorship in comparison to the rest of your income? Those are all, I think, things that can be tested. And I think when you have a strong and effective board of directors, these are things that you can identify early and you can act on.
James, I'm going to go lightning round here, so get more questions in as you have them here. Do you think the activist trend in the United States is positive? What about three hedge funds getting together and driving short-term stock value?
That's a good question. It's really difficult to say whether it is positive or negative. I think the jury is still out, right? I think there are some activists that just takes advantage of a situation and is looking for a short-term gain, and that could be very troubling. But there are some activist investors that take a longer-term view that looks at the fundamentals of the business. And from our experience, our activist investor pretty much saved the company. He injected $2.5 billion of capital. He bought some assets, and he asked some really good questions about the business. So I think it's not a set answer in terms of whether it's positive or negative. I think it really depends on the activist investors that you're dealing with, and I think it's really important for each company, each board of directors, to say, how would an activist investor look at us today, and what would I do? Let's confront those issues proactively.
Thank you, James. Another question for both of you. How do you Michael, how do you move from a culture of compliance to one of active engagement?
I think, I hate to be repetitive, but it comes back to who the board has selected on the executive leadership team. And I think, and the first step beyond that is to recognize that you need to make that transition from one that is checking the box. And I think the famous Enron compliance program that was sitting in a drawer, but that the company had spent quite a bit of money on. I heard a number as high as $10 million, but really obviously didn't do anything. There are a lot of companies that are in that state. If you're not setting up your compensation programs in a way that managers all the way down the line are incentivized to be engaged, in this process, to actively invite, dissent and suggestions from the ranks, I think you're going to stay in the check the box mentality. And while that may lead to some short-term financial gains, it is just, I think as history has shown, it's just simply not sustainable in the long run.
Well, in the financial services industry, we have layers and layers and layers of regulations. So compliance is a big issue. But in my mind, compliance is a necessary but insufficient condition to having good risk management. And what I like to say is that every risk is a bell curve. Right? If there's no variability, there's no risk. It doesn't matter if it's operational risk, financial risk, strategic risk, or even reputational risk. There's the expected value, there's the downside, and there's the upside. And compliance and audit and traditional risk management tend to look mainly on the tail. They measure the extreme losses, and in terms of compliance and audit, you either pass the test or you don't. I think it's really important to think about the entire bell curve, that there is a risk-return trade-off, and that there is an upside to risk, and to be able to understand what those trade-offs are. So you got to be in compliance with laws and regulations. You need to set up risk appetite constraints so you could see where your exposures are. But you need to balance that with the risk-return equation. And I think if you could do that, then it's much more forward-looking, much more business-driven, and then you're tying risk with return dynamics.
Thank you very much, James. right back to you, having seen both models, should the board have a specific risk committee or not? What are the advantages and disadvantages of either model to effective risk oversight?
It's a big question. I think for banks, it's required that you have a risk committee. So it's pretty easy to do, right, when it's required. My perspective is that if you're operating in a large, complex organization, you ought to at least consider setting up a risk committee. So I'm a member of the audit committee, and I chair our risk oversight committee. And I would say if you look at the time allocation, the reporting, and the work, we're about 150% of what the audit committee does in terms of time and stuff. So it's a lot of time. And if you add risk to the audit committee agenda, is it 10%? Is it 20%? Do you have sufficient time to do that? So I'll share with you a good story. I met with the chair of the audit committee of this large energy firm that I was working with. And she had a very good perspective. She goes, the job of the audit committee is to think inside the box, right? You got compliance, you got SEC, you got Sarbanes-Oxley, you got, reporting requirements. You don't want to be creative when it comes to audit or accounting, right? Whereas the job of the risk committee is to think outside the box, to imagine unexpected scenarios, to look around corners, to be really forward-looking in terms of business risk return. And she made that very clear distinction between the two charters. I've seen it work well in different setups in terms of having a risk committee as part of audit and part of the full board in terms of the agenda. So it really depends on the composition of the board. It depends on the maturity of the risk program. But I think at a minimum, it should be considered.
I think in my opinion, if I just give my 2 cents, I think that potentially the worst setup is to have an overburdened audit committee take on that charter and do it in a way that the rest of the board sort of feels like, oh, well, they've got that. I think that's the worst of all scenarios. I think that depending on the size of the board, depending on the industry that you're in, it can be very effective to have the entire board be involved, in looking around the corner. That's sort of why you're there. And I think it can be very counterproductive if a board feels that, oh, well, we've delegated that, to this committee. But it really depends on the circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So at E-Trade, strategic risk and strategy monitoring and execution is at the full board. So even though we have a risk committee and we would look at the strategic risk methodology and challenge the assumptions, the discussion and the reporting and decision making goes to the full board.
Last question, I think we'll wrap it up here, and I can take a stab at this, and then I'm going to ask Michael to jump in too. And it's a question about parallels and lessons learned between the BP incident, BP's response to the Gulf of Mexico incident in 2010, and Volkswagen's response here. Just a quick 2 cents from my part. A couple of similarities and a couple of problems there. One, of course, nobody at BP or reasonably anywhere else fathomed that the incident could have been possible. But as far as the response was concerned, what I saw was board members and management team coming over from London for BP and managing the crisis here. And a couple of things that really came apart for BP were as follows. One, when you're communicating in a crisis, of course, and dealing with key stakeholders, you got to make sure that those messages across all stakeholder groups, that information is entirely consistent. You want to make sure that it's developed and crafted in anticipation of legislation, i.e. do no harm in the response. What we saw with BP, of course, a lot of self-inflicted wounds, but it started really with, you had BP Legal, of course, very quickly turning over lots of documentation to Oversight and Investigations Committees on the House and the Senate side. And of course, as soon as they go there, they get leaked. But that information that they were providing to Congress, Congressional Oversight Committees, and to DOJ and other places was not consistent. It directly contradicted, in fact, what the spokespeople were telling the media, what other government affairs people were telling key folks, what the investor relations function was telling the street, and of course that was a series of self-inflicted wounds that just weakened their credibility, showed that these folks aren't accountable, they're not being transparent, they're not being truthful, and of course the media and other opponents seized on that to spin up this narrative. Of course, the other parallel here that I would say, with Volkswagen is that they seem to be falling into a similar trap. It's one thing for the chief executive to come over into local territory and say, I'm going to give the full human and material resources of my company to get this fixed, to get this right, to get it done, and I'm going to empower this person, probably best to be a local in that region, indigenous type person, to get it done and then get out of there. What we've seen similarly with Volkswagen, and I'm going to turn it to you and then we'll have to close here, is a little bit of an off-message, disjointed response where there has been inconsistent messages delivered to different stakeholders. Some information that has been delivered in various means have been directly contradicted later, so they just seem to be stepping on themselves a little bit. But I'd be curious as to your view there.
No,
see the parallels?
There are great parallels. I mean, very unfortunate parallels depending on if you're a shareholder of the company. I mean, and think about this. In September is when this all came to light. 5-6 days after it came to light, still in September, a new CEO was appointed. Matthias Müller is his name. The next time that he comes to the United States was in January for the Detroit Auto Show. So this wasn't a trip hastily arranged, like we got to go in 3 days and we're still sort of pulling things together. This is something that they knew. This is an annual trip. You might have said, well, maybe you should have come over earlier, but that's beside the point. So he comes in January. And at the Detroit Auto Show, there was an interview, you may have heard about it in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, they all covered it. And he gives an interview to NPR, National Public Radio, that was so inconsistent in terms of its messaging that the media and communications folks from Volkswagen called back NPR a few hours after the interview and asked for a do-over. Which, of course, NPR, did not grant, and then reported on the fact that this is what they're being asked.
Debacle.
Now again, if you're Germany's largest corporation, with that size, that is not the way you want to conduct yourself when you finally come over. And his performance in front of on Capitol Hill was frankly not much better.
Agreed. We are out of time. James, Michael, thank you very much. This has been really stimulating.